All right, good and Arab Shabbos, everyone. It's really hot. Too hot to wear a bekisha, too hot to wear a hat. Still wearing the bekisha, not wearing the hat, but still wearing the yarmulke. And here we are. Somebody asked, one of our friends here asked, how is atheism a religion if Webster's has both of its definitions of religion vis-a-vis relationship to a god or two gods? And so therefore atheism that denies the existence of a god or gods is therefore not a religion. I don't like that definition for this reason. Buddhism is by most definitions considered a religion. That's the first answer. The simpler answer, although the less important answer really than the second answer that I'll give. But essentially, that's the answer. Buddhism really doesn't care what your theology or your beliefs are. It's more about teachings than beliefs. So therefore, one can be an atheist and a Buddhist. The truth is, historically, there were traditional atheist Hindus and monotheist Hindus. Obviously, Buddhism comes from the same Vedic tradition, and obviously Hinduism we understand generally is a polytheistic religion, but it's really a family of many different religions, many different types of Hinduism. I don't know if they've all ever been recorded or counted, or and within the traditions of Hinduism you do have those who understand their pantheon to be a metaphor and believe that either there's really only one god or that actually there is no god or there are no gods, and takes all of the whole ideology and mythology as metaphor and not, as what we would say, in Jungian ideology, to be mythos and not logos. On top of that, you have just the word atheist. A lot of people don't know that in ancient history, monotheists were called atheists, particularly Jews and Christians who believed in an invisible God. This would be pre-Islamic time, but Muslims would also be in this category. The ancient Romans called Jews and Christians atheists because we worship an invisible God. And to them, the term theos or Dios, the deities of ancient Rome that come from, the gods of ancient Greece. These various deities and so forth were all considered to be beings that one could see, one could make a picture of. Some theorize that they were actually based on human beings to begin with. There's actually a tomb of Zeus, or there was recorded in ancient history a tomb of Zeus, meaning to say that Zeus was a human king that was later declared a deity, or perhaps in his own lifetime, and his worship continued afterwards, and so too perhaps a lot of these other gods that were either in kindred of or worshipped throughout ancient history, throughout antiquity. Baby turkeys. The mommy turkey with the baby turkeys. I never saw little baby turkeys. They're really cute. Should have been able to take a picture of them. There's another farmer here who has the quails, and those quails are always in the road, and you got to avoid them. But I avoided the baby turkeys and the mama turkey. So those are wild turkeys, by the way. There's no turkey farm over here that I can see, at least not on the road, as opposed to that quail farm where the quails are just all over the place, and one of them got hit recently, actually. I did see a turkey, looked like a tom turkey, got hit recently too, a big one. I guess that was on the way to work this morning. Anywho, back to our subject. So on the first hand, this this terminology of religion, which the word religos means to be bound to something, and so as far as secular humanism, which can be atheistic, that certainly is someone is bound to an ideology and a particular behavior and so forth based on their ideology. That would be religos, that would be a binding, that would be a covenant, so to speak, that would be religious. And the fact is that living in a society and choosing to reject those ideas is also a religious view, vis-a-vis, and that comes to more what our second answer is, but we won't get to there quite yet. But the other obvious answer is that you do have these groups that we mentioned, that this video that I was commenting on talked about, that mimic Christian churches, or then you have the humanistic Jews that somewhat mimic a Jewish synagogue, call their spiritual leaders rabbis. I think the term spiritual can be applied to someone who is not a believer in the supernatural, because spirituality, as we've discussed, at least according to the New York State Office of Mental Health's lowest common denominator definition, is whatever makes your life meaningful, and that is religion for a lot of people, but many other things. But spirituality includes religion, but is larger than religion, we'll say. And there's more things included in the Venn diagram of spirituality than merely religion. The other point that we want to bring up, so therefore these houses of assembly and houses of community are certainly religious in nature to a certain extent, in that they mimic churches and synagogues and other traditional houses of worship. So I would say there is certainly the obvious religious aspect of that. As well as the hypocrisy that comes along with religion, that they often call us out on for lacking tolerance and so forth, when they also are not tolerant of other people's beliefs and so forth. And some of them, not all of them, certainly there are atheist people who are tolerant. People like Penn Jillette, who are atheist libertarians, but there is a lot of fundamentalism within the atheist community, just as there is in Christian or Jewish or Muslim communities, or any other religious community for that matter, that is dangerous and generally is going to be more dangerous than any religious fundamentalism, because just by the sheer numbers, we see what the communists did. As much as people say, all the wars and so forth were caused by the religion and religious people, it's really not so. For the most part, the wars, religion was the excuse for the war, but politics was the cause of the war. And I've known liberal professors who have stated that. But more than that is the idea simply that religion you know, is one thing, but we see how many millions of people the communists have killed in history, all in the name of atheism. So it's been a very damaging part of the world. And if we get back to to the second part of the issue of, is atheism a religion? And the question is, again, for what purpose are we labeling it a religion? The purpose, I would say, and that I think is most important here, is, to me personally, is when it comes to the First Amendment. And a lot of people, even though they're really one concept, that's a continuity, if you really look into the history and the ideology of freedom of religion, dating back to Jefferson, that really essentially and originally the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause are really one and the same. Here's the quail farm, but luckily none of the quail are out in the road, or maybe it's further up. But it's the Establishment Clause has been reinterpreted so many times, but if we accept these interpretations, we have to be consistent. Now, I think everybody agrees that the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, as people understand it, protects the right to be an atheist, an agnostic, or any other belief or lack of belief, practice or lack of practice, etc. Now, it specifically mentions Congress. Really, originally, very clearly, historically, this did not apply to really any other branch of the government. Which would include the executive and judicial branches of the federal government, and actually the legislature, as well as the executive and judicial branches of state and local governments. And that each state and local government could choose in its own constitution whether or not to include such a clause in their constitution. And if they didn't, the truth was that you could have official religion or religions on the state and local governmental level. It's really only from the 1940s that it's been interpreted otherwise officially by the Supreme Court, and I believe erroneously so. Now, I'm not saying that to say that states should have official religions. I think local governments could. You have a small village where people are all of the same faith. Even though we do have such villages, and none of those villages have official religions. Curious Joel does not have an official religion of Judaism, and neither does Kaiser or New Square. So far, Islamburg is not a village, but I'm sure that once they have 500 individuals living there, they might consider it. They might try to form a village. As of now, it's a hamlet that doesn't really have a governmental structure. But these things exist in New York State, and I think that really these are part and parcel of how the United States was founded, with the ideal of federalism, to say that no, Congress could not establish this, but the state and local governments generally were allowed to. And it was really, the history behind it was that in the late 1940s, the Ku Klux Klan was seeking a means to discriminate against Catholic schools by saying that allowing state funds to go to school buses that carry children to Catholic parochial schools was somehow a violation of the First Amendment. And in the Supreme Court decision there, the court did not find in favor of the Ku Klux Klan. They said that state and local governments and school districts, which are included as local governments, are allowed to provide school buses to parochial schools on the condition that they do so equally for all private schools, and give the same the same rules between all the schools. But in truth, they said, though, that they still do believe that the Establishment Clause applies to state and local governments. But they still, with that, understood. So, meaning there's two issues here. One is, what is the Establishment Clause? And two, does it apply to state and local governments? Meaning to say that the Establishment Clause means specifically that you're going to have an official government religion, the way that there's a Church of England, the way that there's the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, and, as I'm pointing out here, the way that in France and for many years in Turkey, and I think it might officially still be in Turkey even though Erdogan is a Muslim, and in the communist countries, that officially secularism is essentially the official established religion of those countries. Meaning, whereas in the United States, the Free Exercise Clause protects the government, meaning the point where the Danbury Baptist Church was afraid that Jefferson, being more or less a liberal secularist and an old-fashioned, authentic liberal, not a leftist, that how Jefferson, being somewhat more of a, not really a secularist, but certainly not a religious person, not in the traditional way, was kind of what they would call, spiritual but not religious, is kind of the parlance that's used in more modern times. And they were afraid that Jefferson would persecute the religious right, and Jefferson promised them no, that the First Amendment establishes a wall of separation between church and state, meaning to protect the churches from the state, not to protect the state from the churches. That's how Jefferson understood it. That's what the words separation of church and state mean, which do not appear in the Constitution, but are understood to be the intent that Jefferson had in the Constitution. But again, that intention was clearly applied, although I'm sure Jefferson would have wanted it for all the states, but he also recognized the states have their rights. There is such a thing as federalism, and certain states will want an official religion and certain states will not. And so therefore you have to have that balance. And so Virginia had the freedom of religion before the Constitution. But some of these other states had official religions for a period of time, as Virginia did as well originally, until such time that the states on their own decided the federal, meaning, and that's in general, the Supreme Court is supposed to be deciding on constitutional issues on the federal level, and they're not supposed to be interfering with state and local governmental issues and the freedoms that were granted by the Constitution to the state and local governments to make their own laws that are different than the laws of other states. But I'm digressing a bit from the point that I'm trying to make here, and the main point that I'd like to express is that these governments, again, back to what I said before. Everyone agrees that the free exercise clause, quote unquote, applies to protecting the freedom of people to be, for lack of a better term, non-religious. So that means that this choice of non-religion or irreligiosity, atheism, agnosticism, and so forth, and other ideologies are essentially religious ideas that are protected with the freedom of religion. But if A equals B, then B equals A, logically speaking and mathematically speaking. So therefore, if the free exercise clause applies to atheism, therefore the establishment clause also applies to atheism. And even if it's not a religion, it is a religious viewpoint, and that said religious viewpoint should not be the established religion of the United States of America. Now, if from my perspective as an originalist, I would say if individual states or local governments did want to establish such a thing, that would be their prerogative. However, as the left would have us believe and have kind of imposed upon us because of FDR, when he first attempted to pack the courts by just adding new Supreme Court members, and he failed, but then he managed to stick it out long enough that he was pretty much able to put who he wanted to, and so the effect of his governance lasted upon this republic for many years to come because of the Supreme Court appointees that he appointed. And so therefore, within that ideology, we would have to say that if the laws of religious freedom guarantee, and the Establishment Clause guarantees that we are not going to have an official, not only federal religion, but state and local religion, so therefore the state and local, and furthermore, it's often interpreted that there has to be equality, and either equality or non-existence there. If that's the case, then these, which are essentially religious views, and meaning to the point that either, let's say in a public school, either you have to teach a wide variety of views, so you're not favoring one over another, or you have to ignore the subject altogether, and not only with teaching, but with other aspects of schooling. If a holiday concert has to have a Hanukkah song, even though there's only like 3 Jewish kids in the whole school, and I say this as a Jew, I think it's ridiculous. I don't think there's any need for a Hanukkah song in a public school concert somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, where there aren't any Jews, but also I believe that Jewish people belong in private parochial schools, and not in public schools. And I'm against the whole idea of public schooling in general. I consider myself a victim of the public school system, which which I consider to be a horrible thing and a horrible blight upon this country. But if it's here, we have to work within the system that we have. And anyway, so to kind of push atheism in public schools would be a violation of the Establishment Clause, even if atheism is not a religion per se. It is a religious viewpoint that would be both protected by the Free Exercise Clause, and therefore, if it's protected by the Free Exercise Clause, it is just as equally restricted by however you're going to interpret the so-called Establishment Clause. Otherwise, you're being intellectually dishonest and inconsistent. So that is my answer here. The truth is, no, atheism in and of itself is not a religion. There are religious expressions of atheism, and there are atheists who are religious people. Obviously, if you're not a member of one of these atheist churches or humanist quote-unquote synagogues. I mean, the word synagogue just means assembly place. It's not a holy Jewish word. It just means assembly place. As the church also means assembly. So, really, essentially, if you're a member of one of these, so then atheism, you could say, is your religion, or religious humanism, or secular humanism, and so forth. But if you're not involved in that, and not, I was listening today briefly to Dennis Prager, and he mentioned something along the lines of, he said, people were contacting him, discussing with him issues about faith and struggling with faith and so forth. And he said, religious people, believers, struggle with God, struggle with faith. He said that's what the name Israel that God gave to Jacob means. The one who struggles with God, the one who strives with God. Abraham argued with God. There is room for that in traditional religion. But he said he wishes that atheists struggled with atheism the way that theists struggle with theism. And it's a very wise statement. As much as I disagree with Dennis Prager on certain issues, it's a very, very wise statement. Because we should, like my friend Rabbi Meza says, he says a religious person should really at best be a hopeful agnostic. And he's very much influenced, I know, by Dennis Prager. He considers Dennis Prager to be like his Rebbe, and he knows him. I think he's worked with him, he's worked for him. Essentially, that's what I'm talking about here. Is that obviously someone who's just an atheist who doesn't struggle with their atheism, doesn't think about it, is not concerned with community in a religious sense and so forth. They're not within the religious aspect of it. Perhaps maybe they are, maybe they're not. I don't know. But still, it's a religious view, which is the concern of the freedoms expressed in the First Amendment. And again, everybody agrees that these freedoms of the free exercise clause are addressed here, but so too the modifications of the Establishment Clause are equally there, because without the Establishment Clause there is no free exercise clause. That's really the main point. Really, essentially, they're one clause. And just to conclude briefly on the idea of how I approach it as a chaplain, even though I find atheism to be destructive and dangerous in the world, and the most destructive force in human history, or at least aligned with the most destructive forces in human history. With that being said, I recognize, as I said, that a true liberal or libertarian atheist is not a threat. That's the one thing. And then the other thing is, how do I as a chaplain approach this? And I always say, when I have orientation for the new inmates in the prison, I don't care what you believe. I got a volunteer for the Wiccans. He had to leave. I'm trying to find a new one. He might come back. I found a volunteer for the Asatru, for the Odinists. If you're an atheist and you have a group of, let's say, 5 atheists who want to meet with a volunteer once a week who's going to teach you ethics and morals, going to sit down and read Bertrand Russell with you because of the hate, I'm very supportive of that, because as a prison chaplain, I recognize my job is not to convert people to Judaism or Christianity or Islam or any other religion. My job is to protect the religious freedoms of the inmates and to use these tools of people's own religious beliefs as a means of bettering these men who come to be corrected. And so therefore, if ethics and morals are going to be taught from a humanistic, secular viewpoint, they are welcome just as they are welcome from a religious viewpoint. However, if someone is teaching some sort of bigotry or hatred, whether it's from coming from a religious tradition, including my own, or whether it's coming from atheism, and there's someone who's insulting the other religions, that will not be allowed. You can discuss the differences between why you're not from these religions and so forth, fine, but that's the issue there. So that's pretty much what I'm sharing here. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. We'll see you all later. Have a good Shabbos. All right.